All right, guys, moving on to chapter 4, section 2. So now we're going to talk all about the water cycle, which when you think about being in an earth science class, the importance of that. This is such a huge thing in relation to a lot of the stuff that we talk about in earth science class, probably most specifically weather. So the water cycle keeps water continuously recycled, and it also keeps it naturally filtered. It is also called the hydrologic cycle. That prefix hydro meaning water. So if you guys ever see the prefix hydro, that means water. Being a cycle, there isn't a beginning or an end. So when we talk about it, if we pick a spot, doesn't mean that's the start or the end. It's just somewhere in that cycle. The water cycle has been going on ever since water has been on our planet, and it will continue to go on as long as water is here. There's a lot of factors that play into the water cycle. You can see them on this slide here. Probably the biggest one is in the upper left-hand corner, and that is the sun. When you think about the energy source behind this cycle, what keeps it moving, it's going to be the sun. So the sun emits a lot of energy to Earth, and then that energy is going to help drive the water cycle. There's other factors that also help move water in the water cycle, like gravity, as we all know, pulls us down to Earth. It does the same thing with water, where it pulls it down to the Earth, whether or not we're talking about water that's falling from clouds or water that's going down and seeping into the ground. And then the wind also plays a big factor in moving water on Earth from place to place. So lots of parts of the water cycle. So the sun, wind, weather, and gravity all drive the water cycle, and they play an important role in the water cycle in moving this water on Earth. And as we saw in the last section of the chapter, just remember it's important to note that even though we have a lot of water on the planet, there really is only a small amount available to us as human beings. So our parts of the water cycle, remember there isn't a beginning or an end, we're just picking one spot here. So the first part is evaporation. So in evaporation, this is going to be what happens when water goes from a liquid to a gas. So liquid water leaves the liquid phase and becomes a gas called water vapor. So it requires energy input. You are going to have to put energy into those water molecules, get them moving fast enough until they break away from the surface, turn into gaseous water vapor, and then go into the air. So we all know, think about when it rains outside, depending upon what the temperature is, it's going to depend upon how long that puddle lasts. If you have a cloudy day the whole day, maybe that puddle's going to stick around the whole day. On the other hand, sun comes out 95 degrees, that puddle isn't going to last as long because that puddle, when it's 95 degrees outside, gets more energy added to its molecules. Transpiration, the process in which plants lose water through tiny pores on their leaves during photosynthesis. So we may not think of the fact that plants are a part of the water cycle, but they actually are. So you've learned about photosynthesis in the past. So photosynthesis, the process in which plants take in water, they take in carbon dioxide, they produce their own food in the form of sugars, and they also release oxygen, which is a wonderful thing because it provides oxygen for us to breathe. But remember, the part of this that has to do with the water cycle is the plants lose water. So plants have tiny pores on the bottom of their leaves, little tiny holes, and water will actually get out. Same spot where that carbon dioxide that they take in goes inside the plant. If you've ever seen what happens when you have a plant like in a plastic bag before, and in the video you guys are watching this week, you'll see this. If you leave a plant inside of a plastic bag for a little bit of time, you will start to notice water droplets condensing on the inside of that bag, and that's from the plant. So the plant is actually releasing water. Now, certain plants live in environments where they have to deal with a lot of heat and a lot of evaporation, so they'll have characteristics that help them hang on to that water longer. So that would be think of like a cactus. But then you have other plants that are living in areas where there is a lot of moisture, and then they have adaptations to take in that moisture. So condensation, this is essentially the opposite of evaporation. So gaseous water turns into a liquid. So now I'm going from a gas to a liquid. Gas to a liquid, the opposite of evaporation. And in this process, energy is lost. So energy is lost. So you get these water molecules that are in the atmosphere. They slow down just enough to turn into a liquid. And in that process, they lose energy. We see condensation happen all the time in the summertime when you get yourself a nice cold glass of lemonade. You set it on the counter. On the outside of that cold glass and lemonade, all of those droplets start to form on the outside of it. Where did those water droplets come from? They came from the air. You cooled off the air just enough so that those molecules slowed down and turned back into a liquid. So condensation happens in the atmosphere, and when it happens in the atmosphere, we get clouds that form. So clouds are formed from the process of condensation. Water turning into a liquid, and they need something to stick onto, so there's usually dust molecules up there, but that's what they'll stick into. Precipitation, one we're all really familiar with. So if you get enough water droplets in the atmosphere, you can form precipitation, any form of water falling to the earth. So that would be snow, rain, sleet, hail. Those are all forms of precipitation, and we get different types of precipitation based on the temperature outside. So if we're above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to be having rain. If we are below 32, we're going to have snow. And if we're right at 32, that's when we'll start to see those conditions of sleet. Hail is a little bit different in that we're going to have rain falling, but updrafts causes those rain molecules to get pushed back up into the clouds where it's colder. They freeze, they drop down again. Maybe they get pushed back up again, freeze. It's almost like if you've ever made an ice ball before, kind of like out of snow, very similar thing. It just happens in the clouds. The more times those ice particles take a ride going up and back and up and back, the larger the hail that you're going to get. Now that water can also seep down through the soil. When that happens, there's a couple of terms we use for that. Infiltration, so the process of liquid moving through a substance that has many pores. So we will say that water is infiltrating into the soil or the ground. Another term which is synonymous with that would be percolation, as you see in the picture there. So when the water is seeping down through the ground there, that would also be percolation. So those two words actually mean the same thing. So when water falls to the ground, it doesn't necessarily always sit in a puddle. It doesn't necessarily always go to a lake. It'll soak into the ground as well. So groundwater can move through soil because the soil is porous. So don't think of when you get down below the dirt there that it's all rock. And in some areas that is the case, but that is also not the case in all areas. So all of these are parts of the water cycle. Every one of them are happening all the time. And like I said, there's no beginning, there's no end. For us, we just want to kind of keep track of, what's happening. If I'm talking about going from a liquid to a gas, that's evaporation. If I'm talking about plants being involved, losing water, transpiration. If it is gas to a liquid, that's what happens when clouds are made, condensation. When that water falls back to the earth, it's in the form of precipitation. If it soaks down into the ground, we then call that percolation. So all of these things are parts of the water cycle. It's been happening for millions of years. It will continue to happen. And as we stated earlier, it also helps filter the water that goes through the water cycle. Surface runoff, precipitation that reaches Earth's surface that flows over the land, we call surface runoff. The water will eventually reach lakes, rivers, and oceans. When surface runoff goes over the land, it'll actually dissolve and collect minerals and nutrient-rich soil as it flows. So if water flows over the land, we call that surface runoff. Now, surface runoff can obviously be different depending upon what surface it's flowing over. If you're on a steep surface, that's going to be different than a flat surface. If you're on a surface that has sand, that's going to be different than a surface that is really flat, like maybe a parking lot. Groundwater that is collected underground in areas of sediment and rocks are called aquifers. So these are natural water reserves underground, really large water reserves underground. We use them in our country a lot to get groundwater or drinking water for people. We also use it for agriculture to water crops. However, it can take a really long period of time to replenish that water supply. So as the slide states here, anywhere from 300 to 1,000 years. So it's a resource that we need to be careful and aware of so that we don't use it by too much. So when you think of an aquifer, don't necessarily think of an underground lake. Think of gravel that has water in it, that we have access to pull that water out of it. Probably the most famous aquifer in our country is found where you see on the map here. So in the central part of the country, it is called the Ogallala Aquifer. And you'll also notice right along that belt, lots of agriculture in those areas in Nebraska, Kansas, northern Texas, Oklahoma. So the Ogallala Aquifer is very famous for farming, but it's also famous for the fact that we are currently taking water out of it at a rate faster than it can be replenished by nature. So if you look in the picture here, the water level change in feet, we don't want to see a huge change in feet there. If you look at the picture there, the purples, the blues mean way too much water is being taken out of it in those areas. I'm sorry, not the purples and the blues, the oranges there, way too much has been drawn down in those areas. So like I said, hopefully we start coming up with some other ideas or different ways to catch water so that we're not essentially abusing that resource that we have for all of our farmers in the middle of the country. Groundwater that is not pumped from an aquifer will eventually flow to the ocean. And like I've been saying, aquifers are really important water sources. Water also, when it flows to the ground, will flow into areas that we call watersheds. So areas of land that catches all precipitation and surface runoff are called watersheds. Now, watersheds can be something on a really small scale, and it can be something also on a really big scale. So if you look at these oceans that are listed on the slide here, are 5 major oceans, it talks about where the water comes from that goes into there. So just to pick one of them, the Pacific Ocean, water from China, southeastern Russia, Japan, Korea, all will flow into the Pacific Ocean there. So those are very large watersheds. But like I said, they can also be small. Like here would be a cartoon drawing of a small watershed. Now you'll notice along the outside of it, there's mountains, and the topography or landscape in an area will often determine what the watershed is, where the water flows. One would logically think if water flows in that area, it's going to flow to the valley down below. Water doesn't flow uphill. It's not going to work that way. So it'll go down to the middle there, and that would be an example of a smaller watershed. Here's kind of a bigger picture of the United States and some of the bigger watersheds. If you want to pay attention to Minnesota up there, you can kind of see where we're at in Hibbing. We're going to talk about this in class. We're kind of in a really cool spot where we have a 3-way watershed where we are at. But when you look at the colors on the map here, so if you look at Texas, the yellow area down there on the bottom, that would mean any water that falls in that area is going to go into the Gulf of Mexico. That is what those mean. In the green area, anything there is going to go into the South Atlantic or the Gulf as well. So those would be large watershed regions. Here's another map just showing us more specifically the state of Minnesota. And we're going to talk about these also in class. But once again, you guys can kind of pay attention to where we're located at there. We are in a 3-way watershed up there, which is pretty cool. Not that unique when you look in the whole state there. But those different regions, so if you look at the red area on the Minnesota map, that would mean all the water that falls in that area will go into Lake Superior. And if you know anything about the topography in that area, the Laurentian Divide is up there. So you have a really kind of large ridge in northern Minnesota there. So the water is going to naturally flow towards Lake Superior if it lands anywhere in that red region. Volcanoes are also part of the water cycle. When a volcano erupts, water trapped in liquid called magma is released as water vapor into the atmosphere. So volcanoes are actually part of the water cycle because magma, which comes out of the volcano, and then it turns into lava, releases water vapor into the air. Hot springs are another cool water feature that we have on Earth here, a natural water feature. They're the result of groundwater coming in contact with hot rock or magma below Earth's surface. Where do we find these in our country? Yellowstone National Park. There is lots of ancient volcanic activity in that area. If you've heard anything about the supervolcano, we do believe there's a supervolcano that existed in that area millions of years ago. But whatever the case is, the water gets heated up underground, comes up to the surface. If you see the way it is on the left-hand side there, and it gets constricted or kind of pushed into a smaller area, that is where we get geysers. Obviously, Old Faithful, the most famous one, where it's going to erupt at certain times. So geysers are hot springs in which the water pressure builds up and essentially shoots out of the ground from the buildup of all of that pressure. Really quite hot water. I mean, it's very dangerous. If you've ever been to Yellowstone, that hot water can actually kill you. You have to be very careful to not be in that area. The water is literally that hot. So here's just some pictures kind of showing us some very famous world geyser locations. And one thing that we'll notice here is a lot of them are along plate boundaries. If you look at the Pacific plate there's a lot of them, which makes sense because if you're in an area where you have more magma activity or you're close to a plate boundary, you're going to be getting an exposure more to that hot material. So there is Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park. Some of you may have seen it before, but a really cool feature.